This presentation will examine the prevalence of cognitive disability in the American criminal justice system and the concept of differential treatment rooted in the social construct of disability in America. Inequalities and discrimination permeate the education, work, and healthcare systems against various groups of people. Today, I want to emphasize differential treatment against individuals experiencing mental illness or disability in our mass incarceration system, which must first be addressed through a critical lens of historical precedent on how we approach mental deviancy. Our current systems for mental health and justice demand reform in order to protect the rights and dignity of every person and change the voices who tell the stories of the powerless throughout history. Cognitive disability and mental illness are not new parts of the human experience, and neither are the ways in which society responds to them. From the earliest colonial isolation of, quote, defective persons, to insane asylums and madhouses, to today's mass incarceration system, there are commonalities in how we talk about and treat mental disabilities. And I'm not talking here about how we should treat it, but what we actually do. For centuries, societal response to disability has been inward banishment. In all its forms, we have used isolation, segregation, and containment to remove individuals from daily community life and public view. Asylums took hold in the 18th century, and mental hospitals began to open soon after. While mostly neglected and forgotten, the people housed in these institutions were marked by the socially constructed representation of insanity, lunacy, and feeble-mindedness. They were deviant from the norm, and in other words, unfit to be true members of society. The ugly laws of the late 19th and 20th centuries might be a thing of the past, but when we consider the underlying intentions of these municipal statutes that banned any crippled, maimed, or deformed person from the public eye, there are more common goals than we might like to admit. As Kim Nielsen discusses in her book, A Disability History of the United States, people with disabilities were made to be invisible, out of sight and out of mind, justified on the basis of class. Prisons and jails of today's incarceration system arguably perpetuate this same toxic mentality that there is not a place in society for the disabled, and that they more suitably belong institutionalized out of the public realm. Psychiatric institutions, in the many forms they took, were closed systems that segregated people with disabilities from the rest of society. As the U.S. population increased, the legal and medical fields became more concerned on the issue of controlling citizens with mental illness and physical or cognitive disabilities. Their scientific approach formalized the sorting and ordering of such a system, and in the process, fears that the mentally ill posed a serious threat to the future of American society began to gain traction. Early 20th century reformers called to incarcerate feeble-minded adults to prevent crime, insanity, and prostitution from, quote, infecting society, aligning with the eugenics movement. According to the Department of Justice, historical corrections statistics in the U.S., in 1904 there were approximately 57,000 people incarcerated in federal and state prisons for various crimes, growing into 68,000 in 1910, just 6 years later. Among these, however, the number of people incarcerated for social, mental, or physical disabilities far exceeded those incarcerated for crime. Hence, the first modern mass incarceration system really was not of criminal offenders, but of the disabled. Evidently, eugenicists played a central role in progressive criminal justice reform and the foundations for the modern criminal justice system. Its legacy remains strong today. The influence of the eugenics movement persisted in determining who was fit as a participant of society and who was a danger or infector to the good of society. In Laura Appelman's paper, Deviancy, Dependency, and Disability, she writes, "The ties between institutionalization, eugenics, and social engineering have led to the imprisonment of a significant percentage of our population for remarkably similar reasons as we did in the 19th and 20th centuries. We simply do so in different types of carceral institutions." Decades ago, newly freed slaves with physical or mental disabilities faced countless complex difficulties upon being freed, such as mobility limitations, finding employment, and reconnecting with families. The supposed freedom of these slaves quickly transformed into a label of insane, which bred a new inferior class to be marginalized. Imprisonment has the same effect. Whether a just conviction or not, years in prison greatly impacts any individual's future prospects of social, economic, and political reassimilation. Many people with disabilities who already experience discrimination, prejudice, and disenfranchisement based on the social construct of disability are further stripped of human dignity to basic liberties when a criminal record is added to their name. Very similar patterns to the end of slavery were repeated amid deinstitutionalization of the disabled community in the 1970s. Numerous people had been abandoned by their families or caretakers, left without jobs or government assistance, poverty marked their civic life, and they were left with no place to go. Society and community housing programs were unprepared for a decrease in institutionalized people with disabilities by nearly 85% in the span of just 50 years. The closure of some state institutions and asylums that was applauded by some was not accompanied by the appropriate public investment necessary to ensuring the availability of community-based alternatives, and realistically, the problems of institutionalization just increased under a new guise of correctional systems. The Great Depression and World War II significantly deteriorated the institution system that were essentially just warehouses for the disabled by that point. Neglect, abuse, and victimization within the system ran rampant. At first, the number of patients admitted grew exponentially beyond available capacity, and states had become increasingly less likely to allocate sufficient financial resources to meet the demand. The deinstitutionalization movement accelerated after the adoption of Medicaid in 1965, which incentivized states to move patients out of state hospitals and into communities where the federal government could pick up part of the cost. More pressure was placed on the federal government's role in calling for community care rather than institutions, but this only resulted in underfunding of more community-based health services. Many state institutions were emptied as budgets were slashed, and the quality of care in many hospitals declined further, leading to even more demands that they be emptied and closed. In many cases, people had no family connections when leaving, and without a family to support them, and having never lived independently most likely, people with mental illness often turned to the federal government for support. The cycle continued on and on. Ideas for drug-based solutions were ineffective and unrealistic. If not placed back into institutions in the form of welfare hotels, boarding care homes, or nursing homes, many ended up in prisons. In 1981, when the Omnibus Budget Recovery Act repealed funding for mental health centers, nearly all state mental facilities that had housed individuals with disabilities were turned over to the incarceration system. As more and more people ended up either on the streets or in jails and prisons, society failed to commit to ensuring that deinstitutionalization would be equipped with sufficient professionals, resources, and oversight. So did this era really count as deinstitutionalization? A more appropriate label may be reinstitutionalization instead. Never fading from society were the strongholds of containment, control, and separation, which planted the seeds to our modern mass incarceration system. History has formed such an important part of today's carceral practices, and truthfully, we are still living that history. As we continue to debate how best to solve the problems of criminal justice, we must first confront and incorporate the often forgotten story of the imprisonment of the disabled. The criminal justice system is not designed to address the competency of cognitively disabled individuals, as illustrated repeatedly by the lack of appropriate evaluations, restoration programs, resources, and expertise for disabled suspects, arrestees, defendants, and prisoners. In the process, we have enabled identity politics to stain the way we treat disability as a whole. Identity involves many ways of being, but society has taken it upon ourselves to establish the identity of people with disabilities through victimization, fear-mongering, beliefs in dangerousness, and criminalization. As such, complex human beings are reduced to objects to be feared. We must push for the mental health and justice systems to work in tandem to protect the rights, freedoms, and identities of people with disabilities in the carceral system. Criminalization of disability is a construct that has persisted through time. In the era of sterilization, quote, feeble-minded persons were increasingly blamed for pauperism, crime, and prostitution. Further, eugenicists attacked criminals, delinquents, and any person with a disability as problem groups for social and economic malice, establishing parity between disabled and delinquent. As a result, fear of feeble-mindedness escalated in the 1920s and created a category of people targeted for repression. Eugenicists rose in power and influence over trained criminologists, sociologists, and health specialists, instilling the ideology of criminalization that disabled people were dangerous menaces and threats to society. Their overt manipulation of societal norm set the tone for dehumanizing institutionalized patients that transcended deinstitutionalization and pervaded the criminal justice system as we know it. Today, public perceptions of the dangerousness of mentally ill persons and doubts about the use of insanity pleas have encouraged policies that blur the boundary between treatment and punishment. Furthermore, prominent Italian criminologist Cesare Lombroso in the 19th century believed that criminality was inherited and that criminals could be identified by physical defects that confirmed them as being atavistic or savage. His link between degeneracy and criminality encouraged addressing this perceived problem through surgical sterilization, institutionalization, and most relevant to our discussion of modern society, incarceration in penal institutions. The cultural precedent and social construct of criminalizing mental illness worsens the health of hundreds of thousands of people and complicates their recovery by creating additional barriers to housing and employment. It burdens law enforcement and correctional systems as well, and in the process, it costs taxpayers countless dollars. Thus, nobody benefits, everybody pays. We see the repercussions clearly through the disproportionate imprisonment of disabled people, particularly for cognitive and developmental disabilities such as Down syndrome, autism, dementia, attention deficit disorder, learning disabilities, and traumatic brain injury. The level of serious mental health disorders in state prisons has been rising steadily in recent years, up by 11% between 2004 and 2011, as most jails and prisons are not properly prepared to diagnose or treat serious mental illness. And while exact statistics have been difficult to obtain, there are an estimated 45% of federal prisoners, 56% of state prisoners, and 64% of all jail inmates who experience mental health issues in the U.S. today. In addition, adequate care is nearly never an option. Only 12.7% of incarcerated citizens report getting any treatment at all during their sentence, and 6 out of the 10 states with the highest rates of incarceration also have the least access to mental health care. So then we ask, well, what is the alternative? Therein the deep problem lies that there are not really enough alternative options. The lack of effective public health systems leads to a hostile environment difficult to navigate before reaching the locked doors or bars to institutions that perpetuate dehumanization of people with disabilities. There is a significant shortage of mental health support and trained professionals to take on these cases, and as a result, many individuals are just admitted to prison rather than a hospital where there would be more appropriate care. There are 10 times more inmates with serious mental illnesses in jails or prisons than those who remain in state hospitals. And specifically, individuals with psychiatric diseases like schizophrenia and bipolar disorder are also 10 times more likely to be in a jail or prison than a hospital bed. In 2018, 44 states had a jail or prison that held more mentally ill individuals than the largest remaining psychiatric hospital. Sometimes for reasons that there is no other place to go and that there are no services or supports available, disabled people get assigned the destructive labels of felon, delinquent, or criminal once involved in this system. And all over again, the history of eugenics and rejection from society feels too close to home. This graph shows the prevalence of serious psychological conditions among state and federal prisoners and jail inmates by type of disability recorded over a 30-day period from the Bureau of Justice. What stands out most dramatically is the stark difference between prisons and jails' ratio of disability to without disability. Many of those whom the system should be serving are too disabled, fearful, or misinformed to even find appointments at mental health centers as a preventative measure before reaching incarceration. Minority groups are also impacted by the inability to access services, which drives intersectionality of disadvantage and compounds injustice. Furthermore, community mental health staff employed by jails or prisons are not trained properly to diagnose and treat persons with co-occurring disorders, such as intellectual disability and substance addiction. And deeper into the system, there are not nearly enough psychiatrists or medical professionals to provide clarity of answers. Often, mental health is just exacerbated more due to unnecessary forces of weak policies that lack accountability for abuse by staff or other inmates and neglect to the real problems at hand. Subjectivity or ignorance rules criminal cases on accounts of misunderstood disabilities and misunderstood care. Systemic barriers continue, for mentally ill prison inmates are less likely to obtain parole and more likely to serve out their full sentences than the general population. Some even end up in jail with no real accusation of criminal behavior, but rather because our criminal and legal systems have not yet established a more just, ethical alternative. The reflections of the early American response to deviancy are conspicuous. We maintain order through insularity. Whether criminal, insane, or disabled, there has perpetually been an ignorance toward the ideas and interests of people outside one's own experience, imitating cultural imperialism against the disabled community. One of the biggest problems lies in the lack of desire to learn or to listen to the voices of those victimized. The practice of locking up those who are deemed unfit for society is lopsided in comparison to the minimal to no efforts made for implementing treatment with the human beings in mind first. Today, our legal system deprives too many individuals with mental disabilities of their liberty, fundamental rights, and opportunities for consensual treatment and care. The neglect and abuse that filled state asylums and mental institutes of the past continue to permeate the hostile, inadequate environment of public assistance services. The long history of misguided, inflammatory public policies and courtroom principles that have been applied to people with mental disabilities has lended to stigma and prejudice of mental illness as dangerousness or violence. It hasn't always been because of a lack of trying to implement legal protection that these socially constructed ways of thinking have permeated society. Until the 1980s, the law entitled most defendants claimed not mentally responsible for their crimes to be either excused from criminal penalties and rather be hospitalized for treatment in secure surroundings until cured, or partially excised and imprisoned for a reduced period of time. These policies of insanity defense and diminished capacity, however, did not translate into practice. Realistically, few defendants, even with severe mental disabilities, are found not guilty by reason of insanity, and alternative options, such as care and treatment rather than imprisonment, are almost always made unavailable, inaccessible, or not offered as an option. Defendants, who may or may not be formally diagnosed with psychosis or cognitive or emotional impairment, are most commonly sent to prison without any reprieve for their inhibited culpability, or are found guilty but mentally ill, leaving individuals completely responsible for their crimes. This raises a difficult question on where blame should be placed. A mental disability should not entirely exonerate a capital crime or offense of a similar degree, but is this person fully to blame and deserving of life imprisonment? Is their disability at fault before their own personal will? Are fears of disabled people getting away with crime justified? These are complicated questions that are still being unpacked. People with mental illness or cognitive disabilities are still human beings and can be held to some form of social and civic order to ensure public safety. So no, there cannot be full free reign where crime is completely excused by disability. However, it feels a bit dramatic and quite frankly inaccurate that people with developmental disabilities should be feared. The system as it is cruel and unjust, and inadequately addresses the problem without regard for individuals' compromised modes of action, understanding, or self-defense. The problem lies more deeply in the failure of preventative measures to minimize interactions with the criminal justice system in the first place. Early intervention could help the fact that prison inmates are 4 to 6 times as likely to have a cognitive disability than the general population, and when tried, often receive an unfair trial with manipulation over their lack of understanding and limited self-defense. It's hard to argue the abundant statistics that people with disabilities face disproportionate rates of incarceration, not to mention longer jail stays and lower likelihoods for non-jail sentences, such as probation or other forms of community-based supervision. Many times, too, the charges are for non-violent, non-threatening crimes, such as minor infractions like sleeping on the sidewalk, jaywalking, trespassing, or disorderly conduct. Others have ended up in prisons even without true accusation of criminal behavior, but there was simply nowhere else for these people to go. Opponents have concerns about using disability as an excuse and too much leniency, but this likely stems out of widespread mistrust that has been baked into the system for centuries, on all sides. Individuals with disabilities do not deserve the isolated, segregated, inhumane conditions of a prison when what they really need is a chance to be seen, protected, and most importantly, included in society. Despite long-standing federal disability rights laws that require equal access to programs, services, and activities for all people with disabilities in custody, most correctional facilities deprive people the services, medical care, and accommodations they need most. I'm reminded of the Belgian city of Heel, where individuals with cognitive disabilities and mental illness were not rejected but welcomed, not hidden away but celebrated, not corrected but accommodated. Why can't this be the first step before locking these people away and perpetuating the cycle of victimization, not to mention often exacerbating mental health concerns while incarcerating and standing little to no chance for re-entry back into society once released? I think it demands a critical reevaluation of the intersections of the mental health system in America with living facilities, medical intervention, economic opportunities, and social inclusion. In the words of the Human Rights Watch, thousands of mentally ill are left untreated and unhelped until they have deteriorated so greatly that they wind up arrested and prosecuted for crimes they might never have committed had they been able to access therapy, medication, and assisted living facilities in the community. Too many people with mental illness become involved in the criminal justice system because the mental health system has somehow failed, and in turn, legal and public safety officials are forced to make difficult decisions. From the first stages of the process of injustice for people with mental disabilities, they lack agency and they lack capital. They fall to the hands of overarching powers that rely on predominantly unreliable cause for punishment and the mark of ableism of the past, whose agency and capital grant privilege in legal, criminal, and healthcare domains. The long history of discrimination has accumulated in America's legal system, and in the process, we've adopted a legal construct as well as around dangerousness to self or others as a way to address prominent fear about the mentally disabled as dangerous. For example, screening tools typically used in prison settings are not diagnostic tests, but instead screen to gauge the security risk of new inmates. Again, the agency and capital of those at the top can greatly distort what information gets most attention because this notion of dangerousness works in both directions. People with disabilities are especially likely to be the victims of police violence as well. Americans with disabilities are victims of violent crimes 3 times more often than those without disabilities, and according to an investigation by the Washington Post, 1/4 of the individuals shot to death by police officers in 2015 were people with mental health conditions. Others more have suffered brutality and violent treatment by police, often stemming from misunderstandings related to mental health conditions and their disabilities. I want to close with a quote from civil rights attorney Bryan Stevenson, which resonates on this issue of justice. The true measure of our commitment to justice and the character of our society cannot be measured by how we treat the rich, the powerful, the privileged, and the respected among us. The true measure of our character is how we treat the poor, the disfavored, the accused, the incarcerated, and the condemned. And among these categories are the disabled. It is time to reconstruct how we define and address mental health and crime in America, to reallocate the agency and capital of the voices of the victimized. Disabilities may be invisible from the outside, but the problems of socially constructed treatment for disability by incarceration are blinding.